Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers, presented by FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education. It's been such a long week, and I'm just going to make it longer by asking this question. What's new and exciting in your world this weekend?
Well, we got to spend a few days together this week at Freedom Fest.
That's what made it such a long week, right there.
It was great. We should give a shout out to all of the nice fans that we met there in Rapid City, South Dakota.
Yeah, met a lot of really cool people this past weekend. It was really good. I don't like doing social things, but this was okay.
It was. I really enjoyed it. I thought so too. My bit of news this week actually could be a foolishness. I'll show you why at the end. Last week, a Canadian, Ann Hickey, picked up a check for $165,000 from the Ontario Gaming Commission. Miss Hickey had been playing the same lottery numbers for the past 5 years, and the combination finally paid off. Miss Hickey's win got me thinking about differences between lotteries and saving, and how lotteries are both far more popular and far less profitable than saving. Let's take a hypothetical 18-year-old who plays Ontario's Lotto Max, the game Miss Hickey won. According to the Lotto Max website, the odds of winning Miss Hickey's $165,000 prize is 1 out of 4.7 million. So our 18-year-old who plays Lotto Max every day, by the time he reaches age 70, will have played almost 20,000 times. Now, 20,000 times, that's enough that you would think, well, he's got a good chance of winning. But the odds of winning are so low that even having played almost 20,000 times, the probability that our hypothetical person will win at least once is only 0.4%. And this is typical for lotteries, yet people play them all the time. But let's think differently. Suppose our hypothetical 18-year-old, instead of buying lottery tickets, put the same amount of money into a diversified portfolio of stocks and bonds. Each lottery ticket costs $5, so that's $5 per day that our person is going to put into his savings portfolio each and every day from age 18 to age 70. By age 70, the person can expect to have accumulated more than $900,000.
Yeah, but what good is it when you're 70 years old? Come on.
But what good is the lottery when you're 70 years old? You got to play to 70 just to get 0.4% chance of winning.
Well, a couple of things here, maybe 3 things. When I play the lottery, it's not so I can win, it's so I can daydream.
Yeah.
I want to think about all the people I can tell to cram it when I'm looking at my ticket before they pull the numbers. I guess the second thing is, are you sure it's $5 a day? Because, it's 1 or 2 here every week, not 5 a day. I'm not saying it isn't, but that just seems a little excessive. Third, you can't win if you don't play.
Yeah, you can't win if you don't play, but you also can't lose if you don't play.
That's what makes you a boring person. You say shit like that. You're boring.
And let me drive it home. Your odds of losing are 4,699,999 out of 4.7 million.
In my world, that's just Tuesday. I don't know what you're worried about, but I'm going to get us out of this mess and talk about something that was near, so I guess near and ex-dear to my heart. The CEO of Philip Morris, the company that makes lots and lots of cigarettes, most of which I just loved once upon a time, said that he sees an end to cigarettes in Britain, and presumably everywhere else, in 10 years. The chairman of Philip Morris says that they're not going to be making cigarettes anymore. But that's what they do.
You're right.
So we're going to have a very interesting set of circumstances here where their main product, their chief product, is something that fell all out of favor all over the Western world. They took their lumps for quite some time, but they did pivot and they started with heating tobacco instead of burning it. And they've got a spate of products dedicated towards that. And I think all but the most deranged of us will admit cheerfully that that's way safer than cigarettes. I would far rather have people vaping or dealing with some kind of electronic cigarette rather than smoking. But this was just striking to hear the CEO of a company that makes cigarettes say, yeah, we're probably not going to be doing this for much longer.
It surprises me, and I don't buy it. And the reason I don't buy it is I've watched over 20 years of college students go through my classes, and it seems to cycle. There'll be periods in which almost nobody smokes, and then periods in which lots of them smoke, and it goes back to nobody, and it goes back to lots of them. So I find it hard to believe that in 10 years it's all going to be gone. And furthermore, What's Philip Morris's best play? It's to get into marijuana. They should be selling marijuana cigarettes.
That's right, but of course they can't do that yet. I could tell you with 100% certainty they are working on that very thing.
Yeah.
Because of course they are. And another telling thing here, the CEO, a guy by the name of, I'm going to butcher this, Jacek Olkazik, it's that last one I'm pretty sure I didn't get right. You notice he didn't say anything about China.
Right.
Where babies seem to come out of the womb smoking, right? Everybody smokes there. And it was like that in the Middle East when I was there. And I've been to some Eastern European places, same story. So it's interesting that he said England and probably by extension the United States. But here's what he actually said. I want to allow this company to leave smoking behind. I think in the UK, 10 years from now maximum, you can completely solve the problems of smoking. Asked if that meant Philip Morris would stop selling traditional cigarettes in the UK within that time, he was quoted as saying, absolutely. The Marlboro brand would disappear from Britain.
If I was a cynical person, I would say that their long-term strategy is to get into marijuana, and releasing a statement like this will tank the stock price, enabling Philip Morris to buy back their shares in anticipation of them skyrocketing when they announce that they're going to be selling marijuana.
That's a little more dastardly than I'm willing to consider at this point, but I'm going to keep a sharp eye on it just the same. Which, of course, Ant, brings us to the foolishness of the week. And you would have thought, indeed you did think, that idiotic lottery thing was going to be the foolishness of the week. But no, it's not. This week, we do something a little different. I don't think we've ever done this before. But the foolishness of the week is to be found in the city of San Francisco. Why, you ask? Is it because hippies are smoking drugs out in the open? No. Is it because the homeless people are pooping on the sidewalks? No, although both of those things are true. The good people on the San Francisco County Transportation Authority, so that's a thing, those people have decided that it's time to bring out congestion pricing for driving on the roads in neighborhoods that they would prefer you didn't drive through.
How about that? They discovered market forces, did they?
Of course they didn't. It's San Francisco. So what they're doing is going to be a graduated tax, and it's only going to hit people who make over $100,000 a year.
Oh, for Lord's sake.
There you go. That's right. That's exactly right, isn't it? So just like you, I did a little back of the envelope calculating. The price that they're going to charge is $6.50 if you're going to drive during rush hour. Each way, that's $13 a day. You think $5 a day add up $13 a day. In the course of an average year, $3,380 gone from your pocket if you make over $100,000, which if you live in San Francisco, you have to.
Yeah, otherwise you don't live
in.
So, right, yeah.
That's right. You're not living there if you don't. That would be, what, a 3% cut off your income.
Yeah.
Just lop it right off and hand it over. This might be the dumbest thing I've heard in weeks.
And the interesting thing is, it's the people who earn more money who are more able to work remotely.
That's right.
So
that's right.
This tax, like Bush's luxury tax back in the 90s, may actually end up collecting about zero revenue.
Oh, I think that's right. Just as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, you can know that somebody's going to say, see, what we really need is better public transportation.
Right. Yep.
They're going to dump a bunch of money down that black suck hole. And at the end, they're all going to be confused why nobody takes the train and everybody still drives and no taxes are being collected.
Yeah.
There's a way out of this all the way around. You're going to make it so it's cheaper to take a ride into work with the janitor. And people are going to be carpooling in that 72 Pinto just to avoid this kind of tax.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't think of that. Someone who earns less than $100,000 now has an incentive to charge people who earn more for the ride. That's interesting. Yeah.
I'll pay it as long as it's not $13 a day. I'll pay it.
Right.
Because I'm not an idiot and I can do basic math. Mm-hmm. And you can see that whatever they end up shoving out onto the public, it's going to be rife with unintended consequences. We can name them now. Usually we can't name them because they're unforeseen. But here, I can tell you just about what's going to happen all the way around.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not going to be good. They're not going to raise any money. The streets are not going to be any better. People are going to throw a lot of money away on these pie-in-the-sky metropolitan bus and train program. This is asinine all the way around. I got to say, it's got me kind of agitated. People in San Francisco, they deserve it. They chose to live there. Now shut up and take your medicine.
You're saying this, California's particular brand of lunacy lends itself to perfect predictions of the unintended consequences.
Yeah,
their policies are so dumb, we could tell you without leaving our chairs what's going to happen.
I don't even have to open a book.
Right.
It's just not that hard. And for these people, they just can't see it to save their lives. It seems like 90% of the people in California just think that you can declare the truth.
Yep.
This is true, so thereby we do this.
Mm-hmm.
And when that second part doesn't ever work, truth never gets reevaluated.
It's because the law just wasn't written correctly. They'll go back and they'll do it again.
It's always the same thing, right? Oh, we just have to invest more than we did the first time around. So let's throw twice as much at it this time. Sorry, still doesn't work. Oh, well, we didn't get enough. Let's do it again. They are a unique brand of fools in California, and I feel bad for the rational people who are stuck there for one reason or another, right? I always say, well, if you don't like it, leave. I kind of stick with that, but there are all kinds of people who can't leave.
Right.
Your whole family's there, your job, your career, everything is there. You can't just say, oh, I'm going to Idaho. See you later. Sure, when you retire, you can do that, but you know how hard it is for a lot of people to pick up roots and just go. Just because I do it every third year doesn't mean everybody else can.
Right. To get more Ant and James, buy a copy of our excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion. You can find the paper and electronic versions on Amazon and the audio version on Audible.
We're going to have to talk about something that's probably destined to cause some difficulty in our lives with the taxation is theft crowd, because we want to talk about taxation, and neither one of us actually thinks that taxation is theft simply. It shares in the nature of theft. It can be so confiscatory as to be theft, but in its origin, it's not necessarily so. So when we talk about taxation, what do we talk about first?
I want to head off the hate mail because...
First time for everything. Now you don't want hate mail. Yeah.
Because the claim that taxation is theft all the time is predicated on the assumption that we don't owe each other anything.
Right.
And that doesn't sound right. Now, we can argue what it is that we owe each other and how much we owe each other. Is it money? Is it something else? I don't know. But the minute you agree that indeed we do owe each other something as members of a shared society, you open the door to taxation, not necessarily being theft.
And we have to say this, I think, reasonably and forcefully. In the American context, this debate, taxation theft, taxation necessary, has been with us since at least 1733. Prior to that, it was in all of the colonies too, because you have to fund government somehow. So on the one hand, it seems like people have made the case repeatedly that taxation is necessary. And yet in the American context, we also get the argument that taxation is theft. And I think it's a pretty good argument. The problem is those two arguments are irreconcilable. The important part for me is that we've got the United States Constitution, and that's where we begin every consideration we've got. And that document makes clear that taxation is within the realm of the federal government. It's also in the state governments as well.
And you're not finding the argument only in the Constitution. You'll also find it in economics. And even a staunch free market economist is going to say, yeah, there could be situations in which a tax is necessary. The typical example economists will give is in the case of public goods. And by public goods, I don't mean goods provided by government. I mean in the technical sense.
And hang on now, in a technical sense, it doesn't mean stuff I want.
No.
Why don't you give a definition?
Yeah, there's a clear definition. A public good, in the economic sense of the term, is a good that is both non-rival, that is, more than one person can consume the good at the same time, and it is non-exclusive. That is, you can't stop people from consuming it. And I give you a good example of this, broadcast television. Got a television station that's broadcasting an open signal. It's non-rival. You can watch the signal. I can watch the same signal at the same time, and my watching it does not impede your watching it. That's a non-rival good. But it's also non-exclusive, because once the station is broadcasting this signal, it can't stop anyone from listening to it. So that is a public good. The problem with the public good is, how is it that people will pay for this thing? Because, well, if you can consume it without anybody stopping you, why should you pay? And there are several ways you can go about attempting to get people to pay for a public good. And let's stick with the example of broadcast television. One way is to attempt to make it a private good. And you have examples of that. If your station can encrypt the signal so that the only people who can decrypt it are people who pay you for the box or whatever it is that does the decryption. You have transformed it from a public good to a private good. You could charge people for it. Another way to do it is to attach this public good to a private good that can be sold. And in the US, we do this with advertising. The station will send out the signal. Anybody can watch it free of charge, but the station will charge the advertisers to have their product placed there. So it's actually the advertising is a private good. That's what they're charging. And then if you can't do either one of those things, well, you can impose a tax. And interestingly, that's the direction with broadcast television that England went. Whereas in the United States, we did the advertising model. In England, they do the tax. So when you purchase a television in England, you have to pay the equivalent of about $220 per year for owning that television. That's a tax that goes to paying for the BBC.
That tax is theft.
Now, tell me why you say so.
Because it's never ending, it taxes something that is very difficult to tax. I've talked to people who have lived in England and the UK more broadly. And apparently the government sends out vehicles to scan neighborhoods for flickering television lights that they then cross-reference to the list of people who pay the tax. And you get this kind of nonsense. You're essentially sending out goon squads to find people with illicit televisions. And I think once you get to that point, you've crossed the point of reasonableness.
But I think we're conflating two things here. One is the tax itself, and the other is how you go about collecting it. And I agree, it seems nefarious sending out goon squads looking for televisions.
And but come on, if we had a tax in the United States for $3 a year for something, everybody would just kind of laugh about it. But what if I said, and the government will come to your house to collect it, and if you don't give it, the police will come. And we know the minute the police come, the death penalty is a possibility.
But again, you're looking at how the tax is collected rather than the tax itself.
Yeah, correct.
One thing that England could have done, and I'm surprised they didn't, is to charge the tax not on a yearly basis, but as a one-shot deal when you purchase the television.
Yeah, that would have been smarter.
Now, it's going to be much higher.
Yes.
It's going to be a $2,000 tax every time you buy a television.
It might be so high that no one would have it.
Well, yeah, but then again, if you have a television for 10 years, you are paying $2,000. You're just paying it spread out as opposed to all at once. But what we want to talk about here today is how taxes alter people's behavior. And in altering people's behavior, I want to make a very clear distinction between, I'm going to use the legal terms here, tax avoidance and tax evasion. Tax evasion is illegal. That's when you owe a tax and you don't pay it. Tax avoidance is altering your behavior so that you aren't taxed. That's perfectly legal. In fact, we all do it all the time.
Every day.
Yeah, and of course, the simplest way to avoid taxes is don't buy the things that are taxed. And of course, we all understand this. If the government raises taxes on cigarettes, people are going to buy less cigarettes. They're avoiding the tax. But there's some interesting examples. I'm going to give you some that go back in history and then come up to the present. The one that stuck out in my mind is 1655 England. Oliver Cromwell instituted a decimation tax. This was a 10% income tax on royalists, people who were his political opponents. He literally was taxing his political opponents and sent out goon squads to collect this thing. And what struck me about this is we can laugh about it, but it's no different than what's going on right now. Every time Elizabeth Warren says we need to tax the rich and we're going to have a special tax that applies to them, that's no different than Oliver Cromwell's decimation tax.
And I'm going to make the same point I make every single time this nonsense comes up. That tax is unconstitutional.
The wealth tax, yeah.
Absolutely. And you see how we go back to the Constitution as a touchstone. Now, we had an amendment that made income taxes constitutional, and they can be levied against individuals. Indeed, how else would you do it? Wealth taxes, on the other hand, not before another constitutional amendment will that pass muster.
One hopes. The Supreme Court has a tendency to just decide what it wants to decide.
It's a bad habit they've got, without question.
A couple of other interesting examples I ran across. 1700s England placed a tax on bricks to pay for its war in the American colonies. Builders realized that they could avoid this tax by building bigger bricks because the tax was on a per brick basis. So they just built bigger bricks. So if you go to England today, you'll see some buildings with extra large bricks, and you can thank the American revolutionists for that.
So what might have happened then is we can build a house with 4 great big bricks.
4 great big bricks. Well, actually, people complained that this was a tax on the poor because the rich built their houses out of stone, which was not taxed. Round about the same time, England imposed a tax on printed wallpaper. So you can put printed wallpaper up on your walls. There's a tax on that. And guess how people avoided it? They hung unprinted, plain wallpaper and then hired someone to stencil it. Now look at that. That's a complete waste of effort.
Look, man, anything that keeps wallpaper from going up is probably a good thing. Let's just all back off of wallpaper.
We'll switch to Germany. There's a modern one. Most goods in Germany are taxed at 7%, but luxury goods are taxed at 19%. Up until January 2020, so this changed in January 2020, but prior to that, tampons were considered luxury goods.
Oh, come on.
Yeah.
Come on. Now,
Yeah.
I'm all uncomfortable where this is going. You stop it right now.
No, but interestingly, an entrepreneur wrote the tampon book, which was sold in Germany. It was an actual book. It was 45 pages talking about, I don't know, tampons, I guess. But inside the book were 15 tampons. Because it was a book, it was taxed at 7%, not 19%.
That's a pretty slick idea right there.
Isn't that funny?
You've got to admire that kind of thinking. That's good stuff.
This is what people do. They behave in whatever ways they need to behave to avoid the tax while behaving legally. People have a tendency to call it tax loopholes when they don't agree with the behavior, but that's all it is tax avoidance.
Well, I can give you my own example here. One of the biggest expenses I incur on a year-by-year basis is tobacco.
Yeah.
I spend a small fortune on this stuff. Why? Because I love it. What do? I start a business making videos talking about tobacco. Now it's a legitimate business expense.
It's a business expense. Oh my God, you're right.
It absolutely is. I can't be in this business unless I order some tobacco, maybe even the occasional pipe. It's all above board. There's nothing illegal about this. I'm avoiding a tax. It's not tax evasion. I don't owe a tax that I'm somehow nefariously lying about and getting around. No. I'm doing a perfectly legal thing, running a legitimate business, telling stories and smoking a pipe.
Now, somebody could look at that who disagrees with what you're doing and say, well, but you aren't adhering to the spirit of the law.
Yep.
You don't have to. Nobody ever adheres to the spirit of the law. You adhere to the letter of the law.
That is correct.
And Congress could have written the law differently in such a way that you would have to pay the tax, but they did not.
That's right. And I want to point out just how clearly one can be on the side of the law and still benefit. People just seem to think that if you get some kind of deal worked out where you're getting money that you wouldn't have otherwise gotten, or you're not paying money that you otherwise would have paid, which are the same exact thing, by the way, they think that somehow you're dealing in either illegality or immorality.
Right.
And I submit that neither one of those things is true at all.
You mentioned New Orleans, 1944, the cabaret tax. This was the big band era. So you had 50 guys up there on the stage doing their thing and people would dance and all of this. Because it was popular, this is interesting because it's the same reason the bricks were taxed back in England, because there was a building boom. It was popular. Here, going to cabarets, dancing and listening to music was popular. And so what does the government do? It taxes this. The way this works is if you're in a club that provides instrumental music to which no one dances, you're exempt. But if somebody gets up to dance or to sing, there's a 20% tax. The argument is that this contributed to the demise of the big bands and the rise of bebop and jazz, because that was music you couldn't dance to.
Here's a joke for the musicians in the crowd. Imagine somebody dancing in 13 time. Good luck to you. Good luck to you.
Yeah. So, of course, I'm sure there were other factors at play as well, but the tax was a big one, that all of a sudden these clubs no longer wanted the big bands that were playing music that people could dance to. In fact, this case went to the Supreme Court because people tried avoiding it in all sorts of different ways, like they're serving food, but then they take all the food away and then have the music, claiming that, well, this wasn't a club, it was a dance hall. It was a club at the beginning when they were serving food as a dance hall after. And the Supreme Court came down and said something to the effect of, no, you would have to clear out all the food, send everybody away, and then they come back in to count as a dance hall as opposed to the cabaret.
That's just great.
I have a personal example. My father spent his career working for Tetley Tea. And of course, one of the things they make is the iced tea mix. You buy this thing and you mix it with water and you have iced tea. The iced tea mix is basically a combination of dried tea and sugar. Well, Tetley would import both the tea and the sugar. But because of a 300% tariff on sugar in the United States, they did not import the tea and the sugar to the U.S. Rather, they imported it to Canada that did not have the sugar tariff, mixed the two together, and then imported them into the United States because when the sugar is mixed in with the tea, it no longer counts as something to be hit by the sugar tariff.
That sounds absolutely reasonable to me.
Yeah.
And if Congress wanted a different answer, they should have written a different law.
Right, exactly.
And here you find that we're all the way back to the unintended consequences that we always talk about. Well, every tax brings with it unintended consequences. What? Tea and sugar go to Canada now. As soon as you start taxing people, the heavier you tax them, the more these sorts of things you're going to find.
At a small tax, it's probably not worth messing with. But the bigger the tax gets, the more effort people are going to put into avoiding it.
You throw a 30% capital gains tax at me, and I'm going to have to take a hard look around to see what else I can invest in, right?
Yeah, exactly. If you good listeners buy our book, Cooperation and Coercion, we have a chapter on taxation. And in that chapter, we talk about this next case. This was during the Bush presidency, Bush the First. Bush was getting lots of flack politically because he wasn't taxing the rich. And so he said, all right, fine. I'm going to impose a 10% luxury tax on yachts and private planes and expensive jewelry, these sorts of things. And the intent is to tax the rich. And this proposed tax went before Congress Joint Committee on Taxation, which is one of the groups that deals with estimating the effects of taxes. And the Joint Committee on Taxation estimated that this luxury tax would bring in $31 million in revenue.
Two things, Ant. That is absurdly low. If you're looking at the United States budget, $31 million isn't even going to be a hiccup. Second, no way. Not going to happen. If they had called us ahead of time, we would have told them, don't bother with this. It's not going to work.
Right. On your first point, 31 million is, I have to do the math, but it's probably as much as the federal government spends in half an hour. It's a ridiculously small amount of money, 31 million. Hang on, I got to do the math here.
My guess is it's going to be 35 seconds or something.
Yeah, we spend $11 billion a day. So that's 31 divided by 11,000, because that's millions and billions. That's that much of a day times 24 hours. Holy, times 60 minutes in an hour, 4 minutes. The federal government burns through 31 million every 4 minutes.
That sounds a whole lot more right than any other answer we've been thinking about.
Here's this proposed 10% luxury tax, and Joint Committee on Taxation says it's going to bring in $31 million. In fact, not only did it bring in zero, it actually reduced the revenue from other taxes by $8 million. The government was actually worse off after this tax. And why? Because the year after the tax was imposed, a third of U.S. yacht makers had closed. Prior to this tax, the U.S. was a net exporter of yachts. After the tax, we were a net importer.
And don't forget what this really means where the rubber hits the road. A bunch of people lost their jobs.
10,000. Yes.
And the government's not collecting income tax. That's what they're missing out on. But these people all lost their jobs and they're never going to get them back.
The whole thing was simply political posturing.
As is so often the case.
At the expense of the 10,000 Americans.
You might recall that Bush, before he became president, during the campaign, he said, and I'll tell them, read my lips, no new taxes.
Right.
And the day he showed up with more taxes is the day he never had a chance at re-election.
Yep.
You know, these things ripple.
Because agree or disagree with his policy, you're going to be on the left or the right. But for a guy who says, read my lips, I will not do X, and then he does X, you've got both sides against you now. One important tax I want to talk about is a tax that created a sequence of events that led to a major problem that we have now. And this dates back to World War II. In 1942, the federal government imposed wage controls. So it said your wage can't rise any further. It was to control inflation during the time of war. What companies started to do, because they've got to compete for workers and they can't offer higher wages, they started to offer workers whatever the controlled wage was, Plus, the employer would pay for workers' health insurance and pay into the workers' pension.
Guess what happened next, everyone? Guess what happened next?
Right. Well, in 1943, so just 1 year later, the War Labor Board said, yeah, that's okay. Employer contributions to insurance and pensions don't count as wages. Well, if they don't count as wages, then they aren't taxed. What happened? Over time, employers were competing for labor by offering health insurance and pensions, and even when the wage controls went away, everybody, both the employer and the worker, had an incentive to take raises in the form of health insurance and pension rather than wages because the health insurance and pension isn't taxed. And lo and behold, you end up in a situation where a vast majority of American workers are getting their health insurance through employers.
So what we've got here is something that got added to salary as a result of government meddling in the economy. And then it sticks, and then it becomes expensive. And then the government swoops in and says, well, we've got to fix this problem that all you evil businessmen made. And then you get the Affordable Care Act, which is a disaster, a train wreck of a piece of legislation. If they had actually started by saying, well, the government caused this problem, therefore, I would have at least said, hey, finally, somebody's being honest.
We have this nasty tendency that we see a problem and our first reaction is, what can the government do to fix this? Rather than asking, what did the government do to cause this?
All of a sudden, I'm thinking of that cartoon scene where the cat eats the mouse, the dog eats the cat, the lion eats the dog, ... whale.
So here we have this sequence of events. Government-imposed wage controls, which causes employers to offer health insurance and pension because that's the only way to attract workers, to which the government responds and says, okay, contributions to health insurance and pension aren't wages, therefore they are not taxable. And so over time, employers start offering more and more health insurance and pension because both they and the workers avoid the taxes. And that means that you end up in a situation where the vast majority of Americans are receiving their health insurance through their employer. And that means if you lose your job, you lose your health insurance. If you have some medical condition, you cannot get reinsured because you now have a pre-existing condition. And so along comes, in the era of Obama, the call for government to do something because these profit-seeking insurance companies refuse to issue insurance to people who have medical problems. And all of this arises as a result of people attempting to avoid taxes that the government had imposed.
And here's where it gets kind of interesting in a terrible sort of way. There's no easy, cheap answer to the problem of pre-existing conditions in the context we find ourselves.
No, there isn't.
It's going to be a hard case right there. And what can you do?
I agree with you. You're going to have a problem with pre-existing condition. But the way we handle things under law, that because of the tax treatment the employer provides the health care, it exacerbates that pre-existing condition problem. So however many people are subject to this problem, there'd be a lot fewer of them subject to it if it weren't for the way that we treat health insurance under the tax code.
And honestly, I don't know what the correct answer is here. I don't think anybody else does either, or we would have done it.
Yeah.
There's just a lot of bad answers here.
But the problem is a lot smaller than what it appears, absent government intervention.
Absent government intervention, almost every problem is smaller than it appears.
So there's a funny similar one. This doesn't have to do with taxes, but it does have to do with government regulation. At the close of the 18th century, in an attempt to dissuade people from drinking, there was a law passed, and I believe it was a federal law, although the stories I hear come out of New York. And the law was that if you're going to purchase a drink at a bar, you have to have food also.
Right.
And so what happened is bars would attempt to avoid this tax. You would buy a beer and you would get a sandwich. You weren't supposed to eat it. In fact, it was the same sandwich. So you'd sit down, you'd order a beer, and you'd get a sandwich. I would sit down and order a beer. They would take the sandwich away from you and give it to me. Playwright Eugene O'Neill describes this sandwich at the bar that he frequented. He says it was, quote, an old desiccated ruin of dust-laden bread and mummified ham. But that's how they avoided the tax. You buy a beer, you get the sandwich.
On related notes, two related notes. First, this is how buffalo wings got into the public space. bar owners in Buffalo were looking for the absolute cheapest food that they could make and serve at the bar to satisfy these laws. And don't you know, nobody on earth thought chicken wings were worth a dime. This was the worst thing. This was the last cut of chicken. You might as well have been beets and anuses, right? So it comes out that they're going to fry up some wings. And don't you know, the American people came to love that. And a completely new line in our culinary history was caused as an unintended consequence of government regulation. And the second one was when I lived in Utah, you still had this rule. If you walked into a bar and ordered a drink, you were going to buy food.
Huh.
And I found this out once because I said, well, I really don't want food. And they said, doesn't matter what you want.
You have to have
Which is not
you don't
what,
have to eat it, but you have to buy it.
No, it's not typically what you expect to hear from a waiter.
Right.
And the minute he said that, he said, but the absolute cheapest thing on the menu is, and I looked around and everybody had it in front of them. They kept a $2 item on the menu just so you could satisfy it if you wanted to go in and get a drink.
Oh, that's funny. So the moral of all of this is people respond to incentives, and you can't just...
Haven't we said that before?
You can't just wave a magic wand and say, we're going to tax this thing and everything's going to work out the way we predict. No, people are going to react. At the very least, they'll buy less of the thing you've taxed, and more likely, they'll find creative ways to avoid the tax.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Be sure to join us next week when we steadfastly avoid any more talk about taxes, because it actually hurts my stomach. Until then, you could follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. As always, you can join Words and Numbers Backstage, where the conversation continues. And
you can tax James' patience by sending us email at wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
I'll remind all of you that Ant had a different story at the opening of this conversation. So maybe he should be a little more consistent in the things he says in public. Until next week, everyone, just try. I'm begging you, try to be nice to each other. It's not that hard. You can do it. There's no presidential election anymore. Take a deep breath, look at your fellow citizens, and just be nice to each other. See you next week, Ant.
See you next week, James.